We all know the images: the flag catching the first light of dawn, the stoic, unyielding face of the Statue of Liberty, the declaration that all men are created equal. This is the story America tells about itself, a story of liberty. It's a story of a nation born from a revolutionary promise of freedom, a promise it has defended with its treasure and its blood. It's a noble story, a powerful story, but it's not the only one. There's another story, written in the shadows of those monuments. You can find it on quiet battlefields, in the hushed histories of the dispossessed, and in the faint, persistent echoes of chains. We know the ideals America was built on, but what has been the real cost of that freedom? This is the story of a nation's noble crusade and its history of costly contradictions. The birth of the United States was a political earthquake. In 1776, a band of colonial rebels did the unthinkable. In a world of kings and empires, they declared that the rights of mankind weren't gifts from a monarch, but were unalienable and given by a creator. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," they wrote, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This wasn't just a declaration of independence. It was a radical new creed that put self-government at the center of the universe. It was an idea so powerful it convinced farmers, merchants, and artisans to go to war with the mightiest military on the planet. They weren't just fighting to get rid of a distant king, but to build something the world had never seen, a republic built on the consent of the governed. But this ideal came at a staggering price. The Revolutionary War wasn't some clean, heroic fight. It was a brutal, grinding conflict that pitted neighbor against neighbor, patriot against loyalist. In many ways, it was America's first civil war. John Adams, a key architect of the Revolution, knew the price well. "I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration," he wrote to his wife Abigail in 1777. He knew the fight would be horrific, but he believed the principle was worth it. He later wrote to her, "Posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make a good use of it." And yet a fatal contradiction was pulsing right at the heart of this glorious cause. The man who wrote the timeless words, "All men are created equal," Thomas Jefferson, was a lifelong enslaver who owned over 600 human beings throughout his life. He was a man who called slavery a moral depravity and a hideous blot, yet he profited from it his entire life. This was the founding paradox of American liberty. How could a nation built on a promise of freedom also be built on the backs of enslaved people? This hypocrisy wasn't lost on everyone. The abolitionist Thomas Day scathingly pointed out, if there be an object truly ridiculous in nature, it is an American patriot signing resolutions of independency with the one hand and with the other brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves. The contradiction was a raw, moral wound that started festering the moment the nation was born. Jefferson himself seemed tormented by it. He understood how slavery corrupted everyone it touched. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he wrote that the whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. He seemed to fear divine punishment, writing, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." He knew that upholding slavery was like holding a wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. For African Americans, the Revolution was a tangled, dangerous mess. Liberty was a promise whispered on the wind, and they fought for whichever side seemed most likely to deliver it. Tens of thousands sought their freedom by siding with the British, who offered it in exchange for service. But thousands of others fought for the Patriots, hoping that the Revolution's high-minded ideals would one day apply to them, too. They fought, and they bled for a definition of freedom their own country wasn't ready to recognize. The war was won, the nation was born, But a fundamental question was left hanging in the air, a question that would haunt the new republic for generations. Who was this liberty truly for? In the decades after the Revolution, America looked west. A new idea took hold of the national imagination: manifest destiny. This was the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to spread its dominion of liberty all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It was a romantic vision of progress, taming the wilderness and spreading democracy. This expansion was sold as the natural next step of the Revolution's promise. But this crusade for American liberty came at a devastating cost to the people already living there. For Native American civilizations, America's westward expansion wasn't the spread of freedom. It was an invasion. It was a relentless campaign of broken treaties, displacement, and violence. The story of American growth is inseparable from the story of Native American removal. No case makes this clearer than the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokees weren't the savages of frontier propaganda. By the early 19th century, they had deliberately adopted a policy of assimilation, hoping they could coexist with the new American Republic. They created a written constitution modeled on the U.S. Constitution, established a two-house legislature, and developed their own written language. By all accounts, they had become what was known as one of the civilized tribes. But their land was valuable, especially after gold was discovered there. Their progress became an obstacle. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson, a fierce supporter of removal, signed the Indian Removal Act, giving the federal government the power to forcibly relocate eastern tribes to territory west of the Mississippi. The Cherokee Nation didn't fight back with weapons. They fought back with the American system they had adopted. They took their case all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 1832, in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, they won. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct community where Georgia's laws had no force. It was a stunning legal victory. But it was a victory on paper only. President Jackson reportedly defied the court. The federal government moved ahead with the removal anyway. In 1835, a small, unauthorized group of Cherokees signed a treaty giving up all tribal lands for territory in the West. The vast majority of the Cherokee Nation and its elected chief, John Ross, called the treaty a fraud, but the U.S. Senate ratified it by a single vote. It was all the legal cover the government needed. In 1838, the U.S. Army arrived to enforce the treaty. Thousands of Cherokee men, women, and children were rounded up and forced into stockades. Then, they were marched over 800 miles to what is now Oklahoma. It was a brutal, agonizing journey. Disease, exposure, and starvation were everywhere. An estimated 4,000 to 5,000 Cherokees, nearly a quarter of their population, died along what became known as the Trail of Tears. This was the price of manifest destiny. The expansion of American liberty was achieved through what can only be called state-sponsored ethnic cleansing. The ideals of self-government and the rule of law, so celebrated in theory, were tossed aside when they got in the way of land and gold. The freedom of one people was built on the subjugation of another, and as the nation expanded, its original sin, slavery, grew right along with it, festering until it threatened to tear the Union apart. By 1861, the contradictions baked into America's founding finally exploded. The nation founded on liberty was now the largest slave-holding republic in the world. The country broke apart over the question of whether new Western states would be free or slave. 11 Southern states seceded to form the Confederacy, a new nation founded explicitly to protect the institution of slavery. The war that followed was a cataclysm. At first, for the North, this wasn't a war to end slavery. It was a war to save the country. In a famous 1862 letter, President Abraham Lincoln made his objective clear. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he said, he would do it. But the war, and the horrifying cost of the war, changed things. As the casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands, the moral logic of the conflict became impossible to ignore. How could the Union be truly saved if its founding hypocrisy remained? The pressure from abolitionists, the strategic need to cripple the Confederacy's economy, and the brave actions of enslaved people escaping to Union lines all forced a seismic shift. That shift became official on January 1st, 1863, with the Emancipation Proclamation. With the stroke of a pen, Lincoln redefined the war. It was no longer just a war for the Union. It was now a war for freedom. Later that year, on the blood-soaked battlefield of Gettysburg, Lincoln gave this new purpose its voice, declaring that the soldiers who died there had given their lives so that the nation might have a new birth of freedom. This new birth was paid for in blood. The Civil War is still the deadliest conflict in American history. The scale of the carnage was almost unimaginable, and for some, the cost felt like a divine punishment. In his second inaugural address in 1865, Lincoln gave a haunting reflection, suggesting the war was God's judgment on both North and South for the sin of slavery. He spoke of the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil and speculated that the war might continue until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. At the center of this fight were the nearly 180,000 African American soldiers who joined the Union cause. Many of them formerly enslaved, they fought with incredible courage for their own liberation and for a claim on American citizenship. The Union victory in 1865 led to a second American Revolution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery forever. The 14th Amendment established birthright citizenship and promised equal protection of the laws to all. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed that the right to vote could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These Reconstruction Amendments were a second founding, an attempt to finally make the nation's laws match the promise of the Declaration of Independence. Slavery was gone, but the question of equality was far from settled, setting the stage for another century of struggle. This journey through America's past shows that the fight for freedom is never really over. It's a constant struggle, full of progress and painful setbacks. To understand where we are today, we have to face these costly contradictions, because the same questions of who we the people includes and what price we'll pay for our ideals are still on the table. If you think these complex histories are vital to understanding our present, subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the stories that define us. The promises of Reconstruction, won at such a terrible cost, didn't last long. The federal government's will to protect the rights of newly freed African Americans faded. By 1877, federal troops were gone from the South, and Reconstruction was over. What came next was a brutal backlash. White supremacist governments took back power and began systematically dismantling the rights that had been won. This was the dawn of the Jim Crow era, a system of legal segregation and violent terror that pushed African Americans into second-class citizenship. The equal protection guaranteed by the 14th Amendment became just empty words. But the fight for freedom didn't die. It just went underground. It simmered for decades and then exploded in the mid-20th century as the Civil Rights Movement. This wasn't a new fight, but the unfinished business of the Revolution and the Civil War. Leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. brilliantly used the language of America's own founding documents to make their case. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King argued that the destinies of African Americans and America were tied together. "We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation," he wrote, "because the goal of America is freedom." At the March on Washington in 1963, he called the Declaration of Independence a promissory note to which every American was an heir. For Black Americans, he said, that note had come back marked insufficient funds. But he refused to believe the Bank of Justice was bankrupt. He was demanding that America finally make good on its own creed. His dream, he said, was deeply rooted in the American dream, a dream that one day the nation would rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. This final push for legal equality came, once again, at a great cost. A cost measured in jail sentences and marches, in fire hoses and police dogs, in bombed churches and murdered leaders. It was the price paid by countless people who risked their lives to force America to look in the mirror and confront the huge gap between its promises and its reality. From the Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement, the story of freedom in America is a story of deep and often painful contradiction. It's the story of a nation that declared universal liberty while practicing chattel slavery. A nation that celebrated self-government while dispossessing the continent's native peoples. A nation that fought a catastrophic war for a new birth of freedom, only to let that freedom die under segregation. The cost of American freedom has always been twofold: the blood and sacrifice needed to defend its ideals, and the moral and human price of its failure to apply those ideals to everyone. This paradox isn't a flaw in the American story. It is the American story. The struggle to close the gap between the American creed and the American reality is the central defining drama of the nation's history, and understanding that relentless, costly, and contradictory fight is the only way to truly understand America.